What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Board Games Are For Everybody, where today we are talking about Fantasy Forest, a child's first fantasy adventure. This is a game that we picked up in a thrift store for a handful of bucks. I believe it's from 1982. The TSR copyright is from 1980. I believe on the cards it says 1982 as the copyright. But yeah, this is Fantasy Forest. We picked this up thinking that it was basically just going to be some sort of like Candyland-esque kind of game, and I'm a fan of Candyland, so anytime I find something kind of Candyland-esque, I like to check it out. But it actually turned out to be a little bit more than that. We got our player pieces and our really old school cards here. And we're just going to get our board out here. And open up the right way here. We've got our Fantasy Forest board. Now, there are, I want to say, two different versions of this game. There's the one from the 80s, which is the one that we have here. This one's from 82, as the cards tell us down at the bottom of the card there, 1982 on the left-hand side. And there was also one that came out in the 90s, I believe, that had, instead of little player pawns, it had actual like characters, and I believe it also had some different cards that corresponded with said characters to kind of change the game up a little bit. However, ours is from the 80s, so we just have our little classic board game token pawns. Now, the way that the game works is that in Candyland fashion, as we mentioned before, each player starts at the beginning of the board on the right-hand side there, and they're trying to make their way through the board in order to get to Morley the Wizard. I had to check the box to see what the guy's name was. To get to Morley the Wizard, in order to, I don't know, do whatever Morley the Wizard's trying to do. Save the Fantasy Forest from all of these monsters, I suppose. And to do that, players are actually going against, I just shuffled all these cards around. Players are racing each other to get to the end. And to do that, each player draws a card to determine who goes first. So let's just kind of set these up here to see how the play order kind of goes. So we got 7, 1, 1, and 7. So red and blue would go again to see who gets the higher number. 4 and 4, 5 and 5. Geez, 5 and 5, 3 and 3. Man, apparently these were not shuffled very well. 2 and 2, 2 and 1. There we go. Okay, so blue is going to go first. And then from that point, it doesn't really matter what order we go for this demonstration here. So blue is the first player to go. I'm going to shuffle these cards up a little bit here, a little more. Each player is dealt 3 cards at the beginning of the game to form their hand. Try not to drop stuff all over the place. So let's just deal 3 cards out for each player. And then everything else is put in the bottom left here as a deck stack. So let's say this is blue, and then all these other ones will try and remember the order of them. So the blue player has these 3 different cards in their hand. In the top left of each card, you can see a number up there. This number signifies how many spaces on the board you're allowed to move. And the color on the bottom correlates with each different monster. And on the board, you can see some spaces have that color star as well as a colored path. If, say, our blue token was right here, and they decided to use the giant card to move 5 spaces forward, instead of having to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and go here, because they played the blue card, which corresponds with the blue star, they could actually go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can use this shortcut to advance their movements a little farther in the game. So, starting the game, basically, whoever's turn it is, they would draw 1 card to make a hand of 4, and then they would play 1 card down. They would move the number up in the top left corner of the card, 6, 7, and they would end their turn by discarding this card, and they would now be done. So we would move on to the second player. Let's say that red is the second player, so red would draw 1 card. Now let's say, for whatever reason, the red player decided, well, hey, I want to try and get in front of the blue player on this turn because I don't have a whole lot of cards here. So I could try to attack the blue player. And to do that, each player would select 1 card from their hand. Let's say that the red player decided to choose the giant. And for sake of example, let's say that the blue player chose the ogre. Each player would put their card face down, and then on 3, they would flip them up. Because the red player played a card with a higher number than the blue player played, they would move 1 space in front of the blue player for successfully completing that attack on the red player. Lost my train of thought there. The blue player would now take 1 card to bring their hand back to 3, and play would then continue to the next player. If you play a card that is a lower value than whatever your opponent plays, then nothing happens. You just end your turn. You stay at the space you were at when you declared that attack, and you then just move on to the next player. So let's move on to player number 3 here. So once again, let's say that the yellow player wanted to, well, draw a card for the yellow player first of all. Let's say that the yellow player wanted to end 1 space in front of red. So he's trying to come up here. And for sake of argument, we're going to do the same thing that we did before. Let's say that red plays 2 because it doesn't want to get rid of its higher cards. And the yellow player decides to play 6. So the yellow player would defeat the 2 and would be able to move 1 space in front of the red token. However, because the yellow player landed on one of these red spaces on the board, which there's a bunch of throughout the map, because they ended their turn on a red space, they actually get attacked by a random monster. So what the yellow player would have to do is they would have to play a card from their hand. So let's say that they play the goblin down because it's their highest number, the 2, and then they would flip a card from the deck. Now, the Minotaur obviously has a higher number than the card they were able to play down. So because they lost that random encounter with the Minotaur, they have to move back 4 spaces because that is the number of the number of the top left of the card. So they'd have to go back 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, let's say that the enemy or that the yellow player was able to defeat. Just going to pull a random card from the deck here. Let's say that the yellow player was able to defeat the card that got pulled up. Let's say, for example, that a spider got pulled up instead of the Minotaur, and the yellow player successfully defeated that monster attack. They would instead move ahead 2 spaces because that's how many they had on their card. Both cards would then be discarded. The yellow player would refresh to 3 cards in its hand, and play would continue to the next player. And this basically continues until you get to the end of the game. Well, 5 mummies. Each player continues playing their cards down and moving towards the end of the map, trying to use shortcuts or get as far into the map as they can without being sent back from losing monster battles or having opponents overtake them, I should say, by trying to duel them and successfully winning. And basically, that's more or less it for Fantasy Forests. You're just racing to end up at the end of the board with Morley the Wizard in order to complete the game. And yeah, it's definitely a lot more strategic than we anticipated it to be. Now, obviously, it is a children's game, a child's first fantasy adventure, as it were. But it's surprisingly strategic. I mean, when you think Candyland, obviously you're just drawing cards and moving whatever colors come up. And this is more of a combination of like Candyland and actual like dueling mechanics, battling with your opponents, battling with enemies. I guess it's kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons kind of introduction, I suppose. Getting introduced to the different monsters, getting introduced to battles, using the shortcuts, which is very reminiscent of Snakes and Ladders. So it's kind of like a Candyland mixed with Snakes and Ladders, mixed with Dungeons and Dragons. It is surprisingly a pretty fun time if you're into the move and rolls. It's definitely a better time than say just Snakes and Ladders or just Candyland. Even if you like those games, Fantasy Forest is definitely got a leg up on those guys. But that is more or less all I have to say about Fantasy Forest, really. I think it's a fun game. It's different. Definitely would be a great game for kids if you want them to kind of have a little bit of strategy here and there while they're going through. There's a little bit of take that with dueling your opponents to try and get in front of them. And a little bit of strategy play. So yeah, that's all we got to say. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video on Fantasy Forest. Have you played Fantasy Forest, either the 80s version or the 90s version? Let me know what you think of the game. If you have played it, I'd be interested to know. Or if this video made you possibly want to try out Fantasy Forest for yourself. That would be cool too. So thank you guys for stopping by. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully I will see you all next time. But until then, just remember the board games are for everybody. And until next time, peace.